My brother demanded my house for his baby. Now he's suing me, and my parents are helping him, and then I. The moment I opened my front door and saw my brother standing there with his newborn in one arm and a thick folder in the other, I already had a bad feeling crawling up my spine. Something about the way he looked at me, like he was about to deliver a verdict rather than start a conversation, made my stomach clench before he even said a word. I expected him to ask for advice, maybe vent about the sleepless nights and never-ending diapers that came with having a baby. But instead, he wasted no time getting straight to the point in a way that nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. Without even stepping inside, without a moment of preamble or small talk, he simply told me that since I didn't need my house anymore, I should hand it over to him and his wife because they had a child now and required the space more than I ever would. For a full 5 seconds, I genuinely thought he was messing with me, some weird, ill-conceived joke that wasn't landing the way he expected, because there was no possible way he could be serious about what he was saying. But as I stood there waiting for the punchline, his expression never changed, his features carved into something hard and unyielding, his grip tightening on the folder like he was prepared for me to resist. When the realization sank in that this wasn't a joke and that he had actually come here with the expectation that I would just give up my home because he had decided I didn't deserve it anymore, something hot and sharp flared inside my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to stay rational, to act like this was a conversation and not an ambush. I told him I didn't understand what he was talking about and asked him to explain, hoping that somehow, in the process of him saying it out loud, he would hear how ridiculous and entitled he sounded. That hope died the second he started going on about how he and his wife were struggling to keep up with the rent in their tiny apartment, how their landlord had raised their rates unexpectedly, and how, now that they had a child, it was only fair that I stepped up and did what was right for the family. He talked like he was laying out some undeniable logic that couldn't be argued against, as if the mere fact that I was single and financially stable meant I was obligated to give up everything I had worked for so he could live more comfortably without having to put in any effort himself. What made it worse, what made my blood start to simmer just beneath the surface, was the way he spoke about my house, like it was nothing more than an empty structure that I had no real use for, like it wasn't the place that had been left to me by my grandparents in their will, like it wasn't the home I had poured years of my life into fixing up and making my own. He didn't care about any of that, about the fact that I had spent late nights tearing up rotting floorboards, pouring every spare dollar into renovations, giving up weekends and vacations just to turn this house into something I could truly call my own. He didn't care about the history I had with this place, the memories I had built here, the emotional attachment that made it more than just property to me. The only thing he cared about was the fact that, in his mind, I had something he wanted, and he had convinced himself that he was entitled to take it from me. Right as I was trying to form a response, to put into words just how absurd and insulting his demand was, his wife suddenly stepped through the door as if she had been waiting outside for the perfect moment to make her entrance. Angela didn't waste time easing into the conversation or trying to find some common ground. She immediately launched into the same tired speech about how family was supposed to help each other, how they had already planned out how to make this house work for their growing family, how I, as a single man with no dependents, should have no problem finding a smaller place to live because, in their minds, I simply didn't need this space the way they did. The sheer audacity of her standing there and telling me they had already planned out how they were going to move into my home before I had even agreed to anything was almost enough to make me laugh in disbelief. But then, when I looked at her, at the way she had positioned herself slightly behind Luke, her voice filled with manufactured sadness as she talked about how hard things had been for them lately, I realized exactly what was happening. This wasn't a last-minute, desperate plea for help. This was a plan, something they had discussed and plotted out, something they had convinced themselves would work if they just applied the right amount of emotional manipulation and guilt-tripping to back me into a corner. For a brief moment, I tried to keep my response measured, tried to explain that I understood their struggles, but that this house wasn't just some disposable asset I could give away at a moment's notice. But the second the word no left my mouth, the shift in their demeanor was immediate, and startling. Angela's voice trembled, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and she whispered something about how she always knew I was selfish, how I never really cared about them the way they had cared about me. Luke's jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and his voice rose as he accused me of hoarding resources, as if my home was something I had snatched away from them rather than something that had been rightfully given to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't take the bait. I just told them, once again as clearly as I could, that I was not giving them my house, that this conversation was over, and that they needed to leave. But before they walked out the door, Luke tossed the folder onto my coffee table, his lips pulling into something that was almost a sneer as he said, "Think about it. It's what's best for the family." The second the door shut behind them, I let out a slow breath, my hands clenched so tightly at my sides that my knuckles ached, my pulse still thudding in my ears from the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. When I finally reached for the folder and opened it, what I saw made my stomach churn with something ugly and cold. It wasn't just a suggestion or a list of pros and cons. It was a fully detailed plan outlining exactly how they would take over my house. There was a budget estimating their monthly expenses, a timeline detailing when I should be moved out, and even a pre-written letter to my homeowners association informing them of the change in ownership. This hadn't been a request. This had been a foregone conclusion in their minds. They hadn't come here hoping I would say yes. They had come here expecting it, assuming that I would fold under pressure, assuming that I would do exactly what they wanted because that's what I had always done before. For the first time in my life, I realized something I should have seen years ago. To them, I wasn't family. I was just a resource to be used. The next morning, just as I was starting to convince myself that maybe this whole situation would blow over on its own, my phone lit up with a call from my mother. There was no warmth in her voice, no attempt to ease into the conversation like she usually did when she had bad news to deliver. She went straight for the guilt, her words carefully chosen to make me feel like the worst person alive for not immediately handing over my house the second Luke and Angela had asked for it. She told me that families should always put each other first, that I was being unreasonable by keeping such a large home all to myself when Luke had a child now and needed it more than I ever would. When I tried to explain that this house wasn't just some empty space, but a place I had worked hard to turn into my home, she brushed my words aside like they were nothing, repeating the same argument in different ways as if saying it enough times would make it true. Before I could even attempt to end the call, my father's voice came through the speaker, deeper and more restrained than my mother's, but no less insistent in his message. He told me that I had always been the independent one, the one who never needed help, the one who could figure things out on my own, while Luke had always struggled to keep things together. He said that since I was single with no family of my own, I had the freedom to start over somewhere else, that it wouldn't be nearly as difficult for me to move as it would be for Luke and Angela. It wasn't a suggestion, not really. It was an expectation, a carefully worded demand wrapped in the false pretense of reason and fairness. They weren't asking me to consider giving up my home. They were telling me that, in their eyes, I no longer had the right to it. Hearing those words from my father, a man who had always prided himself on being fair and logical, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just disappointment, and it wasn't just anger. It was the realization that no matter how much I had done for this family, no matter how hard I had worked to build something for myself, I would always come second to Luke. It was a truth I had ignored for years, a pattern I had excused because it was easier to pretend it didn't exist than to face the reality of what it meant. But now, as I sat there gripping my phone, listening to my parents tell me that my stability, my comfort, and my hard work mattered less than my brother's convenience, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I told them no. I didn't raise my voice, didn't try to argue, didn't let them drag me into a back and forth where they could twist my words against me. I simply said that the house was mine, that I wasn't giving it away, and that if they couldn't accept that, then there was nothing more to talk about. My mother let out a small, sharp gasp, like I had just slapped her across the face, before she whispered something about how she thought she had raised me better than this. My father, always the more composed of the two, simply let out a disappointed sigh before saying that he hoped I would come to my senses before it was too late. Then, without another word, they both hung up, leaving me sitting there with the dull, numbing weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. I should have expected what came next, should have known that Luke and Angela wouldn't just let this go quietly, that my parents wouldn't simply accept my decision and move on. Within hours, my phone started buzzing with messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them acting like they suddenly had a vested interest in my moral character. Some of them tried to sound reasonable, sending carefully worded texts about how family was supposed to support each other and how I should be willing to make sacrifices for the people I loved. Others weren't nearly as subtle, outright accusing me of being selfish, heartless, and ungrateful for the blessings I had been given. But what truly made my stomach turn was when I saw Angela's latest post on Facebook, a long, drawn-out rant about how difficult things had been for her and Luke since the baby was born, how heartbreaking it was to be abandoned by family in their time of need. She never mentioned my name, never explicitly stated that I was the villain in her story, but she didn't have to. The message was clear, and judging by the flood of comments from people sympathizing with her plight, her performance had been convincing. One woman, someone I vaguely remembered from family gatherings years ago, left a particularly scathing comment about how disgusting it was that certain people could hoard wealth and property while their own family suffered. Another man, a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to since childhood, suggested that perhaps I had become too detached from family values, too consumed by my own selfish desires to see what really mattered. The sheer audacity of it, the way they all spoke about me like I was some faceless villain rather than a person who had simply refused to be taken advantage of, made something inside me snap. I had spent my entire life trying to be the reasonable one, the person who avoided conflict, the one who kept the peace even when it came at my own expense. I had let countless things slide, had swallowed my frustrations for the sake of keeping the family intact, had told myself over and over again that it wasn't worth the fight. But this wasn't something I could ignore, wasn't something I could just let pass without a response. They weren't just attacking my character. They were trying to break me, trying to shame me into submission, trying to make me doubt myself enough to hand over my home without a fight. I refused to let that happen. So I did something I had never done before. I went to my lawyer. I told him everything. I had no intention of taking legal action against my own family. No desire to escalate things to a point where there was no coming back. But I wanted to be prepared, wanted to know exactly where I stood in case Luke and Angela decided to take this beyond social pressure and into something more serious. And it turned out they already had. Because when I came home that evening, tired from hours spent discussing legal protections and potential next steps, I found an envelope taped to my front door. My hands shook slightly as I tore it open, my heart pounding faster with each line I read. It was a notice of legal action. Luke and Angela were suing me for my own house. I stood there on my porch, staring down at the papers in my hands, unable to fully process the level of insanity I was now dealing with. I had expected more guilt trips, more manipulative messages, maybe even another round of dramatic Facebook posts from Angela painting me as some heartless villain, but I had never thought it would actually escalate to something as absurd as a lawsuit. The sheer entitlement required for them to believe they had any legal standing to take my home away from me was staggering. And yet, there it was in black and white. Luke and Angela were actually trying to claim that my house had been unfairly taken from the family estate and that I either needed to sign over the deed or sell the house and give them half of the money. I knew the will was ironclad, knew there was no legal basis for what they were demanding, but that didn't make it any less infuriating to see it written out so formally, as if their blatant greed had somehow been transformed into a legitimate argument the moment it was typed onto an official-looking document. My first instinct was to laugh, not because any of it was funny, but because I needed some kind of physical reaction to keep from hurling the papers onto the ground and screaming in frustration. After everything they had already put me through, after all the messages and the emotional manipulation and the smear campaign they had launched against me, they had still managed to find a way to sink even lower than I thought possible. I didn't even hesitate before calling my lawyer, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached as I explained what was happening in the most level tone I could manage. He didn't sound surprised, which only made my blood boil more, because the fact that this kind of ridiculous entitlement wasn't even unusual enough to shock him meant that people like Luke and Angela existed in numbers far greater than I ever wanted to believe. He reassured me that their case was weak, that there was no legal basis for their claim, that this was just another desperate attempt to pressure me into giving them what they wanted, but it didn't make me feel any better knowing I would have to waste time and energy dealing with something that should never have existed in the first place. The anger I felt toward Luke and Angela was overwhelming, but it paled in comparison to the burning betrayal that settled deep in my chest when I found out who was funding their lawsuit. I should have seen it coming, should have known that my parents wouldn't just stand back and let things play out on their own, should have realized that their willingness to take Luke's side wasn't just a matter of words, but something they were actively working to make happen. And yet, when my lawyer casually mentioned that it seemed like Luke and Angela had financial backing, because there was no way they could afford legal fees on their own, I still felt that sharp, gut-wrenching jolt of disbelief when I confirmed what I already knew in the back of my mind. My parents had been paying for Luke and Angela's lawyer. They weren't just hoping I would give in. They weren't just trying to convince me I was wrong. They were actively trying to take my home away from me, using their own money to fund an attack against me, all while pretending they just wanted to do what was best for the family. The level of betrayal was suffocating, wrapping around my chest like iron chains, making it impossible to think of anything other than the fact that I had been right all along. This wasn't just about the house. This was about how little they valued me compared to Luke, about how they saw me as nothing more than an obstacle in the way of what he wanted, about how they would rather cut me down and watch me struggle than ever ask him to take responsibility for his own damn life. I didn't bother waiting to cool down before confronting them, didn't stop to consider whether it was worth the argument, didn't care if I walked into their house radiating enough fury to burn the whole place down. My mother barely had time to open the door before I was demanding to know how she could possibly justify paying for Luke and Angela to sue me, how she could sit there and tell me she loved me while actively trying to steal something that belonged to me. She looked guilty for exactly 3 seconds before she shifted into the same gentle, patronizing tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting, telling me that they were only trying to make things fair, that they had hoped I would understand, that they were just doing what they could to keep the family together. I couldn't hold back the bitter, humorless laugh that forced its way past my lips, because the sheer audacity of her saying those words while standing in the doorway of a house she wasn't at risk of losing was almost too much to take. There was nothing fair about what they were doing. There was nothing fair about expecting me to sacrifice everything I had worked for just because Luke had a child and I didn't. There was nothing fair about telling me I was selfish for keeping what had been given to me while enabling Luke's endless cycle of bad decisions and entitlement. When I turned to my father, hoping for some kind of pushback, some kind of indication that he at least felt conflicted about what they were doing, he just crossed his arms and told me that Luke and Angela were struggling, that I was financially stable, that it wouldn't ruin my life to start over somewhere else, but it could ruin theirs if I didn't. There was no hesitation in his voice, no remorse, no indication that he had even considered for a second what it meant to put me in this position. In his mind, this was just the natural order of things. Luke had needs, I had resources, and it was my job to hand them over without question. I told them I would never forgive them for this, that they weren't just taking Luke's side but actively trying to destroy my life, that I would never forget the way they had turned against me without a second thought. My mother started crying. My father shook his head in disappointment, but I didn't stay to listen to whatever nonsense they had planned to try and make me feel like the bad guy. I walked out of that house and slammed the door behind me, knowing that no matter how this lawsuit ended, no matter what happened next, my relationship with them would never recover from this. I should have expected what came next, should have known that Angela wouldn't stop at just taking legal action, should have realized that she would use every tool at her disposal to paint herself as the innocent victim of my cruelty. Within hours of our confrontation, I started getting screenshots from friends, texts with links to yet another dramatic Facebook post filled with sob stories about how she and Luke just wanted a safe place for their baby, how they were being forced into a legal battle they never wanted, how heartless it was for family to turn their backs when all they needed was a little help. The worst part wasn't the comments from random strangers who had no idea what was really going on. The worst part was seeing people I actually knew, family members I had grown up with, taking her side, calling me greedy, saying I should be ashamed of myself for hoarding something that could be used to help a struggling family. No matter how many times I told myself that none of it mattered, that the truth was on my side, that I had every right to defend what was mine, I still felt the sting of every word, still felt the weight of every accusation, still felt the crushing isolation of realizing that no one cared about my side of the story. I was fighting a battle I never asked to be part of, and my entire family was against me. I spent the next few days trying to keep myself from spiraling, trying to remind myself that I had done nothing wrong, that I wasn't the villain in this situation, that I wasn't some greedy, heartless monster hoarding a house just to watch my brother's family struggle. No matter how many times I repeated that truth to myself, no matter how much my lawyer reassured me that this case was going nowhere, it didn't make it any easier to deal with the endless wave of judgment coming from every direction. Every time I checked my phone, there was another message from a relative I hadn't spoken to in years, another passive-aggressive text from my mother, another thinly veiled threat from Luke about how I was the one tearing this family apart. Angela's social media campaign against me had gained even more traction, with more people chiming in about how sad it was that some people cared more about property than blood. I stopped answering my phone as much as I could, stopped engaging with the comments, stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds about who the villain was in this story. The longer it went on, the more I realized that most of them didn't actually care about the truth, didn't care that I had never asked for this fight, didn't care that I had never done anything to Luke or Angela except tell them no. They just wanted something to gossip about, wanted someone to point their fingers at, wanted a situation where they could feel morally superior without actually having to put in the effort to understand what was really happening. What I wasn't expecting, what I wasn't even remotely prepared for, was the moment my lawyer called and told me he had found something buried in the lawsuit paperwork that made no sense. I could tell by his tone that he was choosing his words carefully, that he was trying to figure out how to explain what he had just uncovered in a way that wouldn't immediately send me into a blind rage. He asked if I had ever signed any sort of agreement stating that the house was meant to be shared property between Luke and me, if I had ever put my signature on anything that suggested I had acknowledged the house as part of a family inheritance rather than something that belonged to me alone. The second he asked, my entire body tensed with something cold and furious, because I already knew the answer before I even said it out loud. I had never signed anything like that in my life. There was a long pause before he confirmed what I already knew deep down, but didn't want to believe. Someone had forged my signature. Somewhere in the middle of the legal documents Luke and Angela had submitted, there was a falsified agreement stating that our grandparents had intended for the house to be a shared family asset, that I had acknowledged this and agreed to it, that my claim of sole ownership was in direct violation of that supposed agreement. The fact that it was so blatantly false, so obviously a last-ditch effort to manipulate the legal process in their favor, should have made it easier to brush off. But instead, it made my blood boil in a way I had never experienced before. It was one thing for them to sue me out of desperation, one thing for them to try and guilt me into giving them my home, one thing for them to drag my name through the mud on social media, but forging legal documents was another level entirely. I asked my lawyer what my options were, if there was any chance this could actually work in their favor, if I needed to be worried about it holding up in court. He reassured me that the forgery was obvious, that we could prove it, that it was more likely to sink their entire case rather than help them, but that proving it would take time. The legal process wasn't fast, and until the truth came out in an official capacity, Luke and Angela would continue pushing their narrative, acting like I was dragging things out just to be spiteful, pretending that they were the real victims in this situation. I wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, Wanted to call Luke and demand to know how he could possibly justify something this low, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. There was no reasoning with people who had already convinced themselves they were entitled to something that wasn't theirs. There was no explaining logic to someone who had spent his entire life believing the world owed him whatever he wanted just because he wanted it. What made it even worse, what made my stomach churn with something dark and bitter, was that my parents still refused to acknowledge that Luke had done anything wrong. When I confronted them again, when I told them what the lawyer had found, when I demanded to know how they could possibly still defend him after this, my mother just sighed and said I was making too big of a deal out of everything. She told me that I needed to stop being so stubborn, that Luke was just trying to do what was best for his family, that all of this could have been avoided if I had just done the right thing from the start. My father, standing beside her with his arms crossed, didn't say much at all, just shook his head like I was the one who had disappointed him, like I was the one who had crossed some kind of unforgivable line. It was in that moment, standing there in my parents' living room, looking at the people who had raised me and realizing they would never, under any circumstances, be on my side, that I felt something inside me finally snap. I had spent my entire life trying to be the good son, the one who never made waves, the one who never asked for too much, the one who did everything on his own so that no one else had to worry about him. And what had it gotten me? A family that saw me as nothing more than a safety net for Luke, a group of people who only cared about me when they needed something, a house full of people telling me to just roll over and let myself be walked all over because it would be easier for them if I did. I told them I was done, told them that if they wanted to throw away their relationship with me just to coddle Luke, then they could go ahead and do it, but I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. My mother gasped like I had just announced I was never speaking to them again, like she hadn't been actively trying to help steal my house, like she hadn't been pushing me toward that decision with every word out of her mouth. My father just let out another disappointed sigh, as if I had just confirmed every negative assumption he had ever had about me, as if he was the one who should be hurt by this and not the other way around. I turned and walked out before either of them could say anything else, before I could let them twist my words into something they could use against me later, before I could let them get into my head and make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. That night, when I got home, I found myself going through all of Angela's social media posts, looking at the way she had been painting herself as the victim, reading through all the comments from people who had no idea what was actually happening. As I scrolled, something caught my eye, something that made my breath catch in my throat. A photo she had posted that same day, showing off a brand new nursery set, complete with expensive-looking furniture and a designer crib that probably cost more than an entire month's rent. The caption beneath it was something about how every baby deserved a beautiful space to grow up in, but all I could focus on was the sheer hypocrisy of it all. The woman who had spent the last month crying about how they were barely making ends meet, the woman who had built an entire sob story about how they couldn't afford to live in a tiny apartment, was out here spending hundreds, if not thousands, on luxury baby furniture while simultaneously demanding I give them my house for free. For the first time since this all started, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready to fight back. The moment I saw that picture of Angela proudly showing off her brand new, high-end nursery furniture while simultaneously claiming they were barely scraping by, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain. I had already been furious, had already been pushed to the breaking point by the sheer entitlement, the forged documents, the lawsuit funded by my own parents. But seeing that blatant display of hypocrisy took everything to an entirely different level. It wasn't just that they were lying. It was that they weren't even trying to hide it, weren't even making an effort to be discreet, weren't even remotely concerned that someone might put the pieces together and realize they were playing both sides. They were crying to the world about how unfairly they were being treated while simultaneously spending money on luxuries they had no business affording, and it made my blood boil in a way I had never experienced before. I had spent so much time trying to take the high road, trying to be the bigger person, trying to reason with people who had made it clear they had no interest in being reasonable. I had wasted hours of my life defending myself to family members who had no intention of listening, who had already decided I was the villain, who had already chosen to believe the version of events that made them feel better about siding against me. But as I stared at that picture, as I read through the comments filled with praise and adoration for how much Luke and Angela were doing for their child, I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. These people didn't deserve my patience. They didn't deserve my attempts at understanding. They didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt I had been so desperate to give them. They had chosen their side, had made it clear exactly what they thought of me, had gone out of their way to treat me like I was nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them get away with it anymore. Instead of trying to ignore it, instead of letting the anger eat away at me in silence, I decided it was time to make sure every single person who had been blindly supporting them finally saw the truth. I started gathering everything I had: the messages, the legal documents, the evidence of the forged signature, the proof that my parents had been bankrolling their ridiculous lawsuit, and every single piece of financial hypocrisy I could find on Angela's social media. I wanted to make sure that by the time I was done, there wouldn't be a single person left who could pretend they didn't know exactly what was happening, who could continue believing that Luke and Angela were the innocent victims they had been portraying themselves as. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to dismantle every lie they had built, tear down every piece of the story they had so carefully constructed, make it impossible for them to ever manipulate another person into siding with them again. My lawyer had already been building a case against them for the forged documents, but now I wanted to push even harder, wanted to make sure there were actual consequences for what they had done, wanted them to feel the weight of their actions the same way I had been forced to carry the burden of their selfishness for months. He had already reassured me that we had more than enough evidence to prove they had falsified the agreement, had already confirmed that there was no possible way for them to win the lawsuit, but I wanted to go beyond just winning. I wanted them to regret ever thinking they could pull something like this. I wanted to press charges for fraud, wanted to make sure they understood that they weren't just going to walk away from this without consequences, wanted to make it clear that I wasn't going to be some passive victim they could steamroll just because they had decided they deserved something that didn't belong to them. When I told my parents I was moving forward with pressing charges, when I made it clear that I wasn't just going to let this end with a quiet dismissal of the lawsuit, the look on my mother's face was something I would never forget. It wasn't shock, wasn't anger, wasn't even sadness. It was disbelief, as if she genuinely couldn't comprehend how I could possibly be doing this to my own brother, as if she hadn't spent the last several months proving to me over and over again that she had no problem watching him do it to me. She tried to plead with me, tried to tell me that I was taking things too far, that I didn't have to go through with this, that I could still choose to be the bigger person and let it go. But I had spent my entire life being the bigger person, had spent years letting things go, had spent months being made to feel like I was the problem just because I had the audacity to say no to something so incredibly outrageous. I told her that if they had wanted to avoid this outcome, they should have thought about that before helping Luke forge legal documents to try and steal my house. I told her that if she wanted to blame someone for tearing the family apart, she should be looking at the son she had spent her entire life enabling instead of the one who had done nothing wrong. I told her that if they were expecting me to feel guilty, to second-guess myself, to change my mind at the last minute just to keep the peace, they were going to be waiting a long time, because I was done letting myself be manipulated by people who had made it clear they didn't care about me at all. My father didn't say a single word during the entire conversation, just stood there with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a firm line, his disappointment practically radiating off of him in waves. It was the same look he had given me the last time we argued about this, the same silent condemnation, the same quiet insistence that I was the one who was ruining everything. But this time, I didn't feel even the slightest urge to defend myself, didn't feel any need to explain, didn't care if he thought I was the villain. I had wasted too much of my life trying to prove myself to people who were never going to see me as anything other than an afterthought. I wasn't going to waste another second.